Thank you very much. Good morning, everybody, and thank you very much for having me. Before I start on my presentation, just a quick word, quick disclaimer. As some of you know, I also have functions at the OECD and various international organizations. Whatever I'm going to say today has nothing to do with OECD and should not be attributed to OECD. This is a piece of research which was commissioned by CISPE as an academic, which I undertook with Mario Luca, who is sitting over there to the right of me. So it is as a private researcher that I'm here today. I would like to talk about potential market distortions in the cloud infrastructure service market. And some of you may know that we produced a report about 2 years ago, and we are working on the second one. And what I'm going to do today is go briefly over the first one and also the value added of the second one, which is a work in progress. And I will explain what that means in a second. So what I want to talk about are 4 or 5 items. The first, a few things about, seen from the point of view of an economic analysis, some of the striking market characteristics which may lead to be concerned about the possibility of disruptions of competition or distortions of competition. Second, to go into some of the practices that, because of the structure of the market, may lead, in fact, to such distortions of competition. Third, to go over the survey of evidence on problematic behavior that we have undertaken through interviews with a number of users of cloud services. Four, and last, some cost calculation, because the second report that we are working on tries to assess what is the importance of the damage to that potentially distortive practices impose on the community. The last word will be a call for action, because, as I said, this is a report which is not yet finished. We're still trying to gather more evidence to make our results even stronger than they are. And I will call on you to try to see whether you would be willing to participate in this study. So let me go to the first point, which are a couple of comments about the characteristics of the market, which, from the point of view of competition and from the point of view of economic analysis, are particularly interesting. So not only is it the cloud service market, not only is it a rapidly increasing or fast-growing market, but it's also a market where there's been a shift over the last 6 or 7 years, which you can see on this slide, a shift towards more concentration of a few large actors. For example, you can see on the slides that the share of Microsoft, for example, went from 6% in 2015 to 21% in 2021. We have the same development, let's say, for Google, which went from 2% to 7%. This increase in concentration has 2 features. One of them, aggregate concentration, has increased considerably, and the market, which was where the largest 4 operators represented about 50%, 49% exactly of market share in 2015. They now represent 77%, which by every competition matrix would be a highly concentrated market. Second feature, this concentration was to the benefit of a few firms, which you see on the, with Amazon keeping, going up and down, but keeping pretty much the same share of the market, but a lot of the smaller operators losing market share. Second dimension of the market structure, 2 things. One of them is that we should distinguish between the infrastructure and what we call in this report the adjacent markets. And the adjacent markets may be operating system, or they may be productivity software. And what is very clear is that some of the largest players also have a very strong position, either in operating system, that would be the case, for example, of Microsoft, or in productivity software. And as you can see on the slide, that would be the case of both Google and Microsoft. So this, of course, raises a number of questions about how competition is going to develop on such a market. Whenever you find those features, large concentration, complementary markets, with some players which are integrated in the sense that they are operating on several markets, whereas others are not integrated, you have a number of questions that come to mind. The first one is the fact that when you have very, very large players who have the benefit of scale, they clearly may have a huge advantage in competition because of their scale and their ability to absorb fixed costs like R&D costs or other fixed costs, and therefore there may be a tendency towards even more concentration as the market develops. The second issue that comes to mind is what is the relationship between the various sub-markets and the extent to which there is a tying of services, which may mean that if a player is, for example, very strong on an adjacent market, he may, through some way of tying with the markets on which he's not so strong, develop its market share on those other markets to the detriment of non-integrated. The third dimension is the fact that there may be, of course, cross-subsidization, particularly if there's dominance on some of the adjacent markets. The extra profit which is made in those adjacent markets can be used to subsidize some of the activity in the markets, for example, the infrastructure market, which is growing rapidly. And finally, quite aside from any practices that may be undertaken by the large player, this is a sector where there are very large switching costs. We've heard about them in the initial presentation of the Director General. And switching costs mean that customers are not going to be very easily able to switch, to move to another supplier. So this is going to add another layer of complexity or another layer of difficulty for competition to actually work in the sector. So let me go into a little bit of detail at the analytical level on the kind of practices that may distort competition that one can think of. And part of this is some of the things that we found in the first report and that we analyzed in the first report, but which was reinforced in the current report. So let me go directly to example. Let's say that a software provider, so the blue software provider here is the integrated firm, both at the level of the software and at the level of the infrastructure, the virtual machine. So he can give both services. And there are some players who are not integrated, but at the level of infrastructure, at the level of the virtual machine, provider B is able to offer services. Now, you would expect that in a competitive environment, customers would be able, they have, when it comes to the, given the dominant position of the A provider, they would have to use the software of the provider A, but that when it comes to the infrastructure, they would have a choice between A and B, and they could try to run this software on the infrastructure of either one of the two. That means that in such a market, there could be a certain amount of competition, at least at the level of the infrastructure. That is true only if there are no practices which are implemented by the A provider to try to prevent this competition from happening. And that's where we can have what we call the input foreclosure. And that can come in two forms. One of them is on the slide here. Let's say that A ties the two services that it provides and says that my software will be sold together with access to my virtual machine, my infrastructure. In that case, the infrastructure of producer B becomes useless because it cannot get the access to the software of provider A. But there's a second thing that the integrated provider can do. It can just increase the cost for anybody who decides to use the infrastructure of B. Now, we have really good examples of this. One of them is the Microsoft 2019 change to the bring your own license policy, whereby customers had to repurchase their Microsoft software license if they wanted to deploy on third-party infrastructure services. Now, this is typically an application of what I was talking about, with a number of results, of course. The first one is that the independent infrastructure providers had either to lower their own price or to get out of the market because they were not competitive anymore, because anybody who wanted to switch to them had to pay this extra charge, surcharge. Second, it also allowed, or it could have allowed, the integrated provider to increase the price of using his infrastructure, at least up to the point where the increase in price of the infrastructure would reach the price of the repurchasing the licenses. So we have two effects of this. One of them is the possibility of exclusion of independent providers, and the second one is simultaneously a possibility of lower choices for the consumers, but also possibly an increase in price for the consumers of the services. Let me go to customer foreclosure, which is another possibility. So let's say that we have a situation where there is, again, an integrated provider of services, and where the customer relationship management software of producer of supplier A needs the information that is going to be provided on the enterprise resource planning system of the provider A. And let's assume that the provider A has a dominant position or a monopoly on the enterprise resource planning system. Again, we can have the same logic, the fact that by preventing the customer relationship management software of a competitor from accessing the data of the ERP, then producer A, vertically integrated, can in fact block the competition at the level where there is competition. If we had a competitive market, there would be a competitive market at the level of the CRM software, and the consumers could choose which provider they want. That is as long as provider A doesn't prevent alternative software provider, CRM software provider, from getting access to the data that can be found in the ERP software. Now, this, of course, and we have the same kind of logic as before, there are two ways to block this for the dominant producer. One of them is to integrate the supply of the services, but the second one is to impose an extra cost on consumers who desire to use the CRM of a competitor. Now, interestingly enough, when you look, there is kind of an example, which is the SAP indirect access practice, where SAP policy requires a payment of a license surcharge when the data which is generated through the SAP ecosystem is accessed by non-licensed users. Now, this is the type of foreclosure that we were talking about. So what it means is that, in fact, increase the price of access to its customer base and makes its competitor less competitive than they would be otherwise. So what we see, and this very much came out of the first report, is that not only is there a theoretical reason to be concerned, but one can find practices that seem to match those concerns in reality. Now, let me now go on to what we've done since the first report. So we have interviewed a number of firms, and I will just give you a little details about the interview process. First of all, the firms that we've interviewed tend to be large enterprises with experience of migrating on-premise infrastructure onto the cloud. So people who've been confronted with the situation where they were wondering whether they could make competition work. Second, participants were invited to answer a survey, and this was followed by deep, in-depth interviews with an attempt to get from the respondents qualitative and quantitative elements regarding what they consider to be an abusive practice or distorting practices. And the data collected was then used to try to assess partially some of the costs which were incurred due to those practices, to try to have a notion of what we're talking about. Now, as I said, this is a work in progress. We need more firms to come and talk to us, which is not so easy, mostly because cloud users are often very reluctant to speak. Being an ex-antitrust enforcer, I spent most of my life in a culture where the idea was don't trust the competitors, trust the customers. If you're looking for an anti-competitive practice, the competitors have no interest in revealing it because they benefit from the fact that there's not so much competition, whereas the customers are the ones who are the direct victims of those practices. Well, in this exercise, it turns out that asking the customers does not always lead to the results that one would hope, because they are frequently afraid of retaliation. And I think that what is really important and maybe distinctive in this sector compared to other sectors is the fact that there is necessarily, because of the switching cost, quite aside from the practice, a long-term relationship between the supplier and the customer. And that means that there is always the fear on the part of customers that something may happen if they speak on what they think is abusive or what they think is distortive of competition, that there might be retaliations. And in the course of the interview, we were given a number of examples of practices which seemed, or at least were interpreted as retaliation, whether it was in the licensing conditions or in the checking of the conditions by the supplier to the customer, etc. Now, as a result, there's a certain amount of passivity on the part of customers in these sectors because they are afraid to speak. And this shows into some of the quotes that we found, which are, of course, anonymous, but to give you a sense of what the feeling was, one quote, "We're dealing with a market that is very close to what we have in organized crime scenes, to the point where you're risking your career if you say something." I mean, that's fairly extreme, I agree, but it does reflect an anxiety on the part of customers about what could happen if they complained about anything. Some of the other quotes are clearly there's a pricing distortion whenever there's any attempt to try to use the infrastructure of a competitor, and either we have a system which is designed to prevent that, or if it doesn't block it completely, then there's a price to pay for doing that. Now, those conditions, of course, lead to suspect that, in fact, things are not as good as they could be in this sector from the point of view of competition. When one goes into more deeper analysis of what the customer are saying, they emphasize two things. One of them, which is really at the heart of the study that we're doing with Mario Luc, is the license portability issue, because this seems to be at the core of much of the, or many of the problems that they find. So here we have some elements that come from those interviews. Microsoft severely limits users' freedom to deploy and virtualize on-premise licenses on externally hosted infrastructure. Respondents highlight that there are no specific technical reasons, so that's a common theme. Many of the customers said there's absolutely no reason for this, no technical reason. Okay. So this is entirely a strategic move on the part of the suppliers of services. We have testimony by firms that said, I considered moving from let's say, Microsoft to Amazon, and then I gave up because I knew that the cost was going to be very high in terms of repurchasing licenses, etc. And the same kind of things can be observed for SQL server licenses. So there is a general acknowledgement of the fact that having a very strong dominant position on an adjacent market is necessarily or practically necessarily going to lead to reinforcing the position on the infrastructure market, and that the customers are, because of practices, are prevented from making competition work as it could or should in an ideal world. The second dimension of the problem are the migration costs, which are not necessarily the result of strategic behavior, which may be due to technical behavior, but a lot of the firms that have attempted to migrate their infrastructure have called our attention to the fact that it's very costly, and that those costs are not always anticipated, and that this is a natural barrier. The problem, of course, comes when you are on a market where there are natural high migration costs, and on top of that, there may be additional practices to try to prevent any attempt to make competition work. So the next step was to try to assess the value of the costs which were imposed on them. So first we got testimony. For example, in the Microsoft bring your own license policy, the consensus of a number of interviewees were that the cost of repurchasing the licenses was of the order of magnitude of 80 to 100% of the cost of the original licenses. Okay. Some firms, often some users, estimated that the cost to fully migrate their IT infrastructure, where you would have both the cost of the strategic behavior, but also the transaction cost that I was referring to earlier, would be, that varied quite a bit from, of course, as you would expect from the, depending on the size of the firm, but minimum range was 500,000, and several interviewees said that we were talking about several $1 million to try to move to migrate the infrastructure. The choice to deploy Oracle's relational database management system services on third-party clouds leads, according to some of the interviewees, to price distortion, which double the cost of the native Oracle cloud. So we have 100% surcharge for making competition work, which is, of course, going to be a huge difficulty for the competitors. One respondent remarked that they do not know of any single customer that successfully migrated away from SAP's ecosystem. Again, for the same kind of reason. So we have a number of statements of this kind that tends to help us try to assess what the cost of the policies are. Now, we are in the process of doing this. We have done the exercise for one policy, the 2019 change in Microsoft policy on the bring your own license. Just to give you a flavor of what we've been doing, we've been trying to assess the aggregate cost of that policy in 2019, at the time when it was implemented. And for this, we based ourselves on 3 types of data: the average cost of repurchasing a Microsoft Office 365 license, first element. Second, the average number of Office licenses per firm. And third, the number of European firms that deployed Office on non-Microsoft infrastructure in 2019. Now, each one of those figures is itself the result of a number of hypotheses or consideration. If I take the first one, for example, we had to ask ourselves, okay, what license are we talking about? Because the price of licenses go from 1 to 10 for the Microsoft 365. So we took as a baseline the intermediate one, the E3 license, which cost $331. for the average firm size of office-using firms, for the average number of office licenses per firm, we looked at the average firm size of office-using firms, and we adjusted this average size by the proportion of white-collar workers in the firm to try to estimate at an aggregate level how many licenses were likely to be in that firm. And finally, for the number of European firms that deployed Office on non-Microsoft infrastructure in 2019, we had 4 elements. The number of firms holding Office 365 licenses in the EU, the percentage of cloud users firms in the EU, the share of infrastructure in the entire European cloud market, and finally, the non-Microsoft share of the worldwide infrastructure market. So all those are estimates, of course, and the results in this case are interesting. We're talking of a pure extra cost, which doesn't seem to have any objective justification in terms of service, really. We take the baseline, which is the intermediate license, and the average total cost estimated is of the order of magnitude of $400 million for 2019, which in itself doesn't seem to be that much. But if you compare it to the Microsoft productivity software revenue that same year, which was about $2 billion, means that we're talking about 20% surcharge or increase in their total sales through the application of this practice, which of course did not apply to all the buyers of the license of Microsoft, but was concentrated on a small number of them who got a huge increase of 80 to 100% because they had to repurchase the license. But at the aggregate level, that would come to something like 20%. Now, 20% is interesting because when you think about cartels, which is the worst, I mean, supposedly the worst thing you can do in competition, it's usually considered that really bad cartels tend to increase price between 10 and 20%. Okay? So we are talking about the same order of magnitude. Now, we've got some other estimates there. We used an EU Commission study to which we added some of our findings to try to have a minimum estimate of the cost of, for a firm that possesses about 100 licenses and 200 terabytes of data, of switching from Azure to another cloud provider, and came up with the fact that it would cost at least $143,000, $24,000 of which being the surcharge due to the licenses, plus you have to add some of the switching cost, which may not be factored in the analysis. So we're talking about very substantial amounts. Let me finish by the call to action. I'm going to skip the summary of our findings, hoping that I've been clear previously and that you have pretty much it in mind. But I just want to point out the fact that it is not only that we have exclusionary and exploitative practices, it is that because there is, to the extent that there are practices which restrict unduly competition, that means that there is going to be less innovation in the European cloud infrastructure industry. And there is also a cost, a dynamic cost, which is not counted, but which is very serious because we do know that innovation and dynamic costs are very important. So how can one intervene against this? Well, there are roughly 2 ways. One of them, of course, is antitrust. And Article 101 and 102 in this case of the EU Treaty. And the other one is to think about the extent to which those practices could be covered by the DMA or should be covered by the DMA. And then there's a question about whether or not the Commission should undertake a serious study of the sector to try to decide whether there is a need to write obligations, to impose obligations on gatekeepers. Because what we have here is a typical gatekeeper issue, if we do think that the gatekeeper issue as a content. And there are some provisions of the DMA which seem to apply directly to some of the things which have been mentioned. So it's, first of all, cloud providers offer a core platform service, which is something that the DMA is recognizing. Second, it would think that in terms of gatekeeping, you know that there's a definition of gatekeeping, which is both a quantitative and qualitative definition, but it seems that some of the operators at least would qualify as gatekeepers, which would possibly lead to questioning whether those gatekeepers meet two of the standards which are on the right on the slide of the DMA. One of them says that gatekeepers will not be allowed to restrict consumers' choices by preventing them to switch. So the question is, are there some practices there which are designed to prevent people from switching? And second, gatekeepers providing hardware or software using operating systems, we also have to ensure equally effective interoperability. And there are also questions about whether there is any attempt to degrade interoperability whenever a customer wants to switch to an alternative provider. So that could be a way, and probably the best way to use the DMA would be, in fact, to ask the Commission to do an investigation of the sector so that it could have a bespoke regulation after having analyzed, try to come up with obligations that are targeted exactly at the problems that one finds on the cloud infrastructure market. Now, to get there, one has to bring elements to the Commission to convince the Commission that it is useful. And for this, we need your contributions. We need you to come to us. We absolutely guarantee anonymity. And I don't think that anybody, even whether in the first report or since then, has ever been concerned. I mean, there's been concern about this, but it's clear that we're respecting entirely anonymity, and we're making sure that firms cannot be recognized. But having more example and having more assessments from firms would help us focus or have even more solid results, a more convincing result for the Commission. Mario Luca is the one who conducts the interview, and I really encourage you to go to him and offer to answer all questions, because this would be in the interest of the community at large. Thank you very much.